Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Understanding Our Founders' Constitution. I am your host, Frank Kushar. For the past several months, we have been discussing the issue of a Article 5 Convention of the States for the purpose of proposing amendments. We have discussed at length the pros and cons of such a convention, the wisdom of it, and whether or not how it is being promoted is in fact how such a convention would actually run. And I hope that I have demonstrated that what you are hearing about it is not factually correct. We have then, since that time, we spent a few of our episodes dealing with that, going through Mark Levin's book, The Liberty Amendments, discussing each of the 11 proposed amendments that he sets forth in it, as to whether or not they make sense or not, and whether or not they are, as presented, wise amendments. And we now reach the conclusion of these with the 11th of his proposed amendments, and this is one with which I can have some agreement with. And this is an amendment to protect the vote. We see so much with voter fraud rampant nowadays. We see a greater percentage of people voting in a district than are registered. We see and hear reports of quite a few dead people still on the books and voting, people who are voting who are not really registered, and just on and on the corruption goes. This is a direct threat to representative government, because it then plays in the hands of those special interest groups who are using this type of fraud to elect people to office that will then support what they want done instead of abiding by the Constitution. And so Mr. Levin's 11th Amendment states that citizens in every state, territory, and the District of Columbia shall produce valid photographic identification documents demonstrating evidence of their citizenship issued by the state government for the state in which the voter resides as a prerequisite for registering to vote and voting in any primary or general election for, and this is important, and Levin did this right, general election for president, vice president, and members of Congress. This is important because the federal government has no constitutional authority to tell the states at all as to how they can and should conduct their elections for those of state or local offices. And so he restricts this amendment, properly so, in my opinion, to those only at the federal level. He then goes on to state, provisions shall be made by the state legislatures to provide such citizenship-designated photographic identification documents at no cost to individuals unable to afford fees associated with acquiring such documents. And so the argument that we hear from the left that, well, we're going to make it too difficult for the poor and the minorities or what have you to acquire such identification is hereby removed by this section. And many states that are requiring, such as we have here in Texas, photographic proof in order to vote, provide this document if somebody needs one and does not have a valid driver's license at no cost. So the idea that it's going to somehow disenfranchise a certain group or block of people from being able to obtain this ID for the purpose of voting is absurd. He talks about early voting. Levin does in Section 3. Early voting in any general election for President, Vice President, members of Congress shall not be held more than 30 calendar days prior to the national day of election, except for active duty military personnel and so forth. And this idea of early voting, I kind of have a problem with that because it gets stretched out so far and so long that perhaps we should say that, all right, we're going to have an election, and instead of just being on one day, make it 2 or 3 days, or start, if it's going to be on a certain Tuesday, then have it the weekend before Monday and Tuesday. Get it all over with at one shot instead of dragging it out for weeks at a time. I think that's just too long. And it says where registration or voting is not possible by person but by mail, then they have to people have to submit an approved citizen-designated photo ID and other reliable information to state election officials to register to vote. So when you register to vote, you got to show that you are a citizen. And that is important. What did the founders have to say, and what does our Constitution have to say about our elections? As you read through the writings of our founders and they talk about voting, they always talk about the people. Does that mean that the people have to be citizens? Well, if you read the debate notes of the Constitutional Convention on August the 7th, you will find that in that debate they were talking about suffrage and who should be allowed to vote or not. And they do use the term citizens in that regard. And the arguments that were being made as to what kind of citizens should be allowed to vote. And the arguments being set forth by some were that only those who were free persons who owned property should be allowed to vote. In other words, people who had, as the phrase now goes, thanks to President Obama, skin in the game. They had something at stake in the government because they would be the ones that would suffer from the tax laws and everything else that the government would pass. And the people who are going to vote need to have an understanding that they have skin in the game. We see down through our history that for a while, unless you owned property at the start, you couldn't vote. Slaves could not vote. Women could not vote until the 1920s. Those who were under the age of 21, but of age 18, old enough to fight in Vietnam, but not old enough to vote. And so we have seen an evolution in our country as to the requisites required for voting. What power does Congress have? What power does the Constitution give the federal government in determining our elective process? Well, let's turn to our Constitution and see what it has to say. Article 1, Section 4. Article 1 is dealing with the powers of the Congress. And Section 4 says that the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. In other words, the states have the power to determine the times, places, and manner of holding elections. However, it goes on to state, but the Congress may at any time, by law, make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators. The reason for that being, at that time, senators were appointed by the state legislatures. And so the Constitution leaves it up to the states to determine the times, places, and manner of holding elections. But who is to be the ones voting in these elections? Well, let's go back. Article 1, Section 2. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states. The people. Now, it doesn't say they have to be citizens, does it? But when we look at the amendments to the Constitution that impact voting, there are 4 amendments that alter the requisites for voting. And I want you to note the language in each and every one of these amendments. The 15th Amendment. This is one of the post-Civil War amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, that impacted how the newly freed slaves were to be treated. Amendment 15, Section 1 states, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so the First Amendment on the idea of voting deals with the idea of nobody because of their ethnicity or race or having been a slave will be denied the right to vote. But it says the right of citizens, not the people, citizens. The next amendment that has to deal with the rights of voting is the 19th Amendment. It says the right of, again, listen to the wording, citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. This gave women the right to vote. Ratified on August 18th, 1920. But again, the language is very clear. It was citizens who would have the right to vote. The next amendment that deals with voting is the 24th. This was an amendment ratified in 1964. Prior to this time, especially in the South, you would be required to pay a special tax or take some sort of a test in order to be eligible to vote. And this was removed by this 24th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for president, vice president, for electors for president or vice president, or for senator or representative in Congress shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state by reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other tax. Again, two things to point out that we want to see here. It was the right of citizens to vote. And look at where that is. It was the right to vote for the national offices, in the same vein that Mr. Levin's amendment that he proposes is, that it is only authorizing the federal government to regulate voting for federal offices. The final amendment that deals with voting was ratified July 1st, 1971, the 26th Amendment. And it states the right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of age. So here we see that the age limit was reduced. And again, note the wording, the right of citizens of the United States. So in each one of these four amendments that directly affects the requisites for voting, it specifies citizens. None of us probably listen to this. I know, I can just speak for myself. I don't vote in any national elections or local elections in Mexico or Canada or France or any other country. Why? I'm not a citizen of those states. I have no right because I do not live under their jurisdiction. And even if I did live under their jurisdiction, because I do not have a tie to that country and the sense of being a subject of it, a citizen of it, I should have no voice or say so in how they conduct their business. Citizenship has privileges. And in each one of these amendments, what did it say? The right of the citizens of the United States to vote. The right to vote is not an inalienable right. It's not a natural right given to us by our Creator. It is a right that is tied to the type and system of government that we have. Those who live in a totalitarian regime headed up by a dictator, they may have elections, but doesn't mean that it's a right to vote. They more or less is just a formality to give a pretense of being free and having the right to choose their leaders, when they really don't. Kings were not voted for back in ancient times. The people had no say-so in who was their king and who was their emperor. It was in our system of government where power resides within the people, where the people are sovereign, that voting becomes an issue. Voting becomes to have citizens vote is completely authority of the Constitution, the authority of Congress, and within the keeping that they are citizens to show and demonstrate that they have the right, something that we need going on in our elections. It's time to put an end to it so that we who pay the taxes, who support the ones who have a say-so and a voice in the type of government that we have and what type of people we have representing us in the Congress and in the White House. So that's my discussion of the Liberty Amendments. I hope you found this discussion over the last several months fruitful and enlightening. And until next Monday, I wish you a good evening and a wonderful week. Good night.